Skies are a constant challenge to the artist, and some of the most exciting of skyscapes are sunsets. The colours that you'll find in a sunset are intense and complex, and very different from the colours that you'll find in skies at other times of the day. And so it's very easy to become heavy-handed and to apply too many layers of paint. Try to avoid overworking your painting by adding a little less detail. Oil paints are the perfect media for conveying the richness of colour, and Margaret is now preparing to work on a study of a sunset in oil paints.
Sunsets are constantly changing and then they disappear. So by the time you've got your equipment set up, they've finished, they've gone. So therefore I like to take photographs, and then when I'm back in my studio, I work from the photographs and from the tonal sketches. I've chosen this one because I was attracted to the colours. This is in the Scottish Hills, and I'm going to use the colours from this. And this is the tonal sketch, which I've changed slightly to introduce a townscape. Today I'm also going to work in oil paints, and these oil paints are slightly different because they're water-based, which means I don't have smelly terps and linseed and all sorts of other things, but just 2 jugs of water, one for mixing with and one for cleaning the brushes. Mix a fairly thin medium of colour just to sketch in with. My sketching in is going to be simplified by painting it with thin paint rather than by drawing with a pencil. And I'm just going to use this purple to sketch it in with. Just enough water to make it flow off the brush quite easily. And then another point I'm going to make is, since this is a sunset and obviously the sky is the important feature, I'm going to drop the eye level down fairly low. And in fact the eye level is the horizon at the back. So that gives me a bigger area of sky than foreground, which isn't as important. The foreground is going to be very dark against the light of the sky. The background hills, I don't want to make too high. I'll just be again suggesting them fading off into the distance there. And then the foreground will come down from that, maybe cut through that. Through here, we'll have a little sort of promontory of land somewhere about here, and just have this sort of jagged shape of the natural landscape. Later I'll have this tree in, but I won't actually put it in just now because I want to have a good clean sweep for the sky. Therefore we'll just leave it at that just now, and basically that's all the drawing that's needed. The rest gives me a lot more spontaneity to get all the colour blocked in. First of all, I'm going to block in the sky because that's the largest area and the most important. And the blocking in, I'm going to use a lovely orangey colour, which I'm mixing with cadmium red and lemon yellow with white. Lovely light creamy colour. This will be the lightest colour of all. So in fact I can keep it very high in key and tone because it will be the lightest, cleanest cut colour of all as it goes across. And then I can start to make it a little deeper now as it starts coming up. I'm not being too particular about the way I'm applying it, nice and freely, and keeping the whole thing with plenty of movement and just deepening the colour. I'm going to move back into the purple, which I had mixed already. And this is really the basic underneath colour, so I want it to be nice and fresh and clean, and that's really enough to block in the sky. Okay, we'll carry on with the next bit of blocking in, which will be the hills, and these will be slightly darker than before, keeping the paint still fairly moist so that it flows off the brush easily. And I'll just take in a little bit more of that colour of red which I had in before on top of raw sienna, just to make it darker. And this is just a base colour, of course. We'll come back and alter it if it needs it. You'll notice that oil painting brushes have long handles, and it is much better if you can keep your hand to the back of the handle So if you feel your hands creeping down, just correct it and pull it back, because it gives you a lot more freedom when it comes to mixing. Right, that's just enough colour for the land, and then I'll just indicate the sea a little darker still before I come back to the lighter colour. The townscape's going to go in here in a sec, but I just want to start reintroducing the colours that we had in the sky, which will be reflecting, and make them a little bit wetter, so that in fact when I'm applying the water, you see I'm putting it on with a vertical stroke, which helps to give depth to the water. I've locked in the rest of this with this lovely dark colour, which is a dark purple made with ultramarine, alizarin crimson and a bit of burnt umber as well, just to darken it even more. And I'll put a touch of white in it now, just to give it a little bit more body, and use it for the distant townscape, which is coming in over here. I won't put any of the angular shapes and the sticks, the poles, etc. I'll just put it in, really blocking it in, getting a fairly straight level along the bottom, and we'll just have it tapering off about there. There we go. And then with that colour, I'll just scrub the brush a bit and take a bit of that colour into the water. So I'm putting that on quite thinly this time to give a little bit of reflection, and again the downward stroke will help to give the impression of it reflecting in the water. There, that's enough for now. That's just to give the suggestion of the town in the distance. Now I'm going back into the sky and starting to link up some of these purples that we've made. So I'll go into my original light purple colour, which had ultramarine and alizarin, and I'll just start to bring some in with a few sweeping brush strokes. Sweeping because I don't want to pick up too much of the colour from underneath. Remember, I want to keep this as free as possible and not muddy. If you start to fiddle about with it too much, it does start to get muddy. And then as I come up a little bit further, it starts to get cooler, so a little bit more water, a little bit bluer, and then I'm going to bring some of this lovely purple, which is beginning to link up with this colour now. And again, the brush strokes are quite important. I'll just thin that down, take the excess off and give it a light, what I call a light glazing, just to give the sweeping direction marks of the clouds. And then towards the top, even more of a cool, darker, deeper. Fairly thin paint this time because I want to show some of the colour underneath. Let it show through. Over here, a fairly opaque colour, so I'll mix it separately so that it doesn't contaminate the more transparent colour, and take it right up to the top corners here. This is also where the tree will come up, so I'm getting plenty of colour into that now. I don't have to be too fussy with this bit because the tree will cover it. I still want hints of the orange from underneath, just showing through. And some of this blue purpley colour should start to come into parts of the water, just lower down towards the land. But again, I don't want to muddy it too much. I'll have some of it in here as well. The important thing to remember about sunsets is not to overwork them, because the sky has to look translucent and free and not too heavy and overworked. So I'm going to leave it as it is and go straight into the very dark trees, which will be mixed up with the same colour as I made before, the very dark purple, which was ultramarine with alizarin crimson. I'm going to make up quite a lot of this actually, so I'll make it fairly thick, a bit more water. And then some burnt umber to make it really dark. And just to make it flow off the brush, I'm going to go for the main trunks, which I started off here already, and we'll take just a sort of broken edge to the, don't try and get too free and too controlled with it, because otherwise it won't look natural. And by holding the brush this way, I find that it means I can lean heavier on the bottom part, the thicker part of the trunk, and then just taper off my hold. A rigger brush would be quite useful for this as well, but you can get quite a lot of the thicker branches just by flicking up from here and making it quite free. And don't be tempted to make up any different colours, because it's totally seen against the light and therefore it's in complete silhouette. So keep it very dark. And it's getting a lot more sort of feathery now. As the paint dries onto the brush, I could start using a touch of dry brush just to give a little bit more texture. By just leaning the brush head slightly to the side, we can get a little bit more freedom and dry brush coming into it. The final touches are just to tidy up the townscape, and in the sketch I put in a few chimneys, just little marks, give it a bit of punctuation, which of course I'll just add touches of reflection in the water. And also, absolutely finally, we'll have some of the bright yellow with white and put some little lights on along the town. Just really a bit of fun that we can put some lights in so that we can then just reflect them as well.
The only reason that we can see objects is because they reflect light. Now, the light source in this painting, for example, is quite clear. The candle that the choir boy is holding is lighting his face. But as we go about our daily lives, the objects that we see will rarely be the result of one single light source. Light will bounce from walls, from ceilings, from objects around us. And it's that light that artists call reflected light. Take a look at this painting by Auguste Renoir, Girl Reading. Light coming from behind the subject bounces back from the book she is holding onto her face. If light is reflected from a coloured surface, it will pick up some of that light. And as that light falls onto the subject that you are painting, it will influence the tone slightly. So as you come to paint that particular subject, you will have to look a little bit more closely at the complexities of it. So, reflected light can make even the most ordinary object a challenge to paint. Portraits often use reflected light, but for the portrait we're tackling in the studio now, we're going to be looking at proportions of the face and how to mix skin colours and skin tones.
When you're doing a portrait, it's a good idea to try different positions and different lighting before you actually choose the final composition. In this one, I'm going to do Malcolm from a profile, because from this side, his face is well lit and I can see plenty of light and dark contrast. He's got quite a pale skin, so I've selected several complexion colours, one of which is actually called flesh tint, but I wouldn't suggest that you buy a flesh tint, because this would not cover every flesh colour. It's a good base colour in this instance, but I'm going to supplement it with a pale cream, a pale pink, a raw sienna and a red earth. But before we start on the colours, let's do some drawing and work out some proportions. Now the best way to start the portrait in any angle is to start just with an oval, which gives you the basic shape that it's going to take up on the page. And if I start with that shape and work from there, I can see that the angle of the neck will be coming out from the side. I always include that fairly early on to get the angle and the proportion. All very lightly put in at the moment because it can be changed, but that gives me the guideline as to the size of head on the page. But because this is a profile, I'm going to just extend this out so you see more of the cranium, the back of the head, and bring the chin out. And you see how the minute you do that, you start to get the effect of a side view of the head, and in fact maybe the neck will be higher up there and the collar will come up quite a bit higher. That looks better. So keep the whole thing flowing and loose so that you can change it. Of course, pastel rubs out easily, so you can just change it as you go along. When you've got the basic oval, you can use the measurement of roughly halfway just to mark out where the eye level will be, and just leave a line. I'm going to be blocking this in soon, so I'll leave the line extended to the outside. And then halfway between that and the chin again just roughly mark out for the nose, and half again will be approximately for the mouth. And that's just a very approximate measurement because of course we've all got different length of features, and this just gives us a guideline. But what it does tell us is that the features are actually contained in this lower quarter, certainly on the lower half of the face. The next thing to do is to take a base colour, in which case I'm going to use a skin tone, but of course remember it will be your observation what base colour you think your model should have. And I'm just going to use that to block in all over, just using roughly the proportions that I've left out for the features, where the eye area will be, the projection of the nose and the mouth, and the projection of the chin, coming down and through and into the neck. Now don't stop the skin colour at the chin. A lot of people do this, and the problem is that it's always difficult to match up the colour. Remember, the one colour of pastel is not going to represent the skin colour. Therefore, as you build up, you want to be covering all the skin colours together. So that's the base colour that just gives me a rough guideline. Now so far I've only used the pale flesh tint, but now I'm going to look at some of the shadow colours, and I'm using this darker red earth colour just to put in, for instance, the indentation where the eye socket is, because that's quite dark. And the side of the nose is dark, down the side here, and of course this plane of the face, the side view of the face, is darker too. So that's going to change the skin colour, and I'll take it right through into here and just leave the front exposed. You'll notice I'm working on the side of the stick, and that helps to block in, which creates a painting effect like a wide brush stroke. And as I block in, I also want to take into account the darker tones of the hair. It's a good idea to take in the shape of the hair at this early stage before you actually worry about the features. In shadow there's greens and browns in the hair, so I'm just using these colours as a mixture to build up the tone together with this pale cream, which will give me the highlight at the front of the hair as well as at the front of the face. You see how that's beginning to shape the head now? Then I can take also the pale pink and start to build up the outline of the profile. And that accentuates the light on the front of the head, on the front of the nose. So all the lightest points are being put in with the lightest colour I've got, which is pink. You see how that shows up the highlights now. The top of the ear is roughly in position to the eye line, so if I put that in there, and the lower part of the ear, the bottom of the ear, is in line with the mouth. That will also be dependent on individuals. It's not a hard and fast rule, it's an approximate rule, but it does help to use the lines, the measurement lines that you've made already to fit in where the ear goes, and then just position that with a little bit of colour. I'm just suggesting where it might go at the moment, as it might need to be moved later. Now I could do with one more darker brown, just to put in some extreme darks. For instance, here in the ear itself, that's very dark. Behind the ear is very dark as well, and there's a lovely big cast shadow which will make it really stand out. And the back of the hair, which is actually quite dark too. I'll use the softer brown. And you'll see already I'm beginning to change the lines that I made initially. These were just guidelines to start with. So I'm going to bring this in here and across. And also taking into account the background, because the background is very dark at this side. So I'll use this blue, which is very similar to the paper colour, and use it over here, which will also negatively select the profile of the face. You see how I can shape up the features with that background colour? So it's very useful to have that. That's helped to shape up the nose a little, in the same way as I want to get this indentation just below the mouth. And that's tidied it up a little. Also, the same blue is quite a useful cool colour for putting into the face, because remember, the face must have some cool colours as well as warm colours. Every picture, in fact, needs a balance of warm and cool, and this is in fact why I've used a dark blue paper, because the blue is quite complementary to the flesh colours. Now, just before I start working again on the features and building them up, I'm just going to change the back of the neck here. It seems to me that the hair is a little bit longer at the back, so I'm going to drop that line down and just add a really dark blue now, just to strengthen this shape at the back of the neck as the collar comes round. You'll notice I'm sometimes half closing my eyes. This helps to actually screen all the midtones and shows up the lights and the dark contrasts, which are the main important features. They have to be distributed properly before I start getting too detailed. Now, with the features, I'm going to use a light brown. It's quite a soft brown, which helps me to just position the features, and then if they're not quite right, I can move them about. The front of the eyelid is also catching the light from the front, and even the paler pink would be better for that. Now, the good thing about painting a profile is that you don't need to do too much detail of features, because you don't actually see the full eye. All I'm seeing here at the moment is the highlight on the eyelid, and in fact I've almost got the eye already, because there's an overlay there with the top lid which creates a little shadow in the corner of the eye, and a little touch of shadow just underneath, just to catch the main lights and darks of the eye itself. And at this stage, quite early on, I like to just screen the rest of the face and check the proportions are right. And really, I find that this is probably not going back enough. So I'll go back to the blue that I had, which was very close to the paper colour, and I'll use that to cut away like that. And that gives me a better impression. Now that I'm happy with that proportion, I can move down a little bit more and move into the length of the nose. And this point here is where the nostril is fairly dark here. Therefore I can make that stand out by catching the light on the cheek. And it helps to just build this up little by little so that you can gradually recognise the person that you're doing. Of course, it's helpful if it's someone that you know very well. I know this face very well because Malcolm's my husband, so I should know his face pretty well. It's rather useful that each connection leads to the next, so that the mouth is actually going to be led in from the nose, and this line here is helping to take me there. The top lip, which is projecting out slightly. I can see already that I'm going to have to drop the mouth down a bit, so by pulling that down and just smudging, that takes away the mark that I left for the mouth line. Remember I said that in the beginning that the lines were just a rough judgment. So I've pulled that down now, and the mouth is going to start down here. I'll just try that for position. Of course, what's also showing up now is because I've lengthened that, this needs to come down too. So again, I'm going to pull the chin down. This all sounds very painful, but eventually you'll get the whole process. You see how even just by pulling that down, I've made the face longer, and that's going to allow a bit more space to develop the mouth. I'm using the point of the pastel too now because it's helping to control the drawing aspect. So the point of the pastel stick helps to draw, and the side of it is for painting. And then the lower lip, which is quite thin, it's not a broad lip. Again, my cutting in tool, the same blue as the background, is useful here because I can cut away the shape that I made. The beauty of pastel in portrait is that the whole thing's very mobile, and you can push and pull it around to make it look more convincing. So the jawline is coming here, and in fact I'm going to change the neckline too, because the chin is actually starting here and coming out broader. And the minute I add that, he looks a bit older, but much more like him. That green isn't standing out quite enough now, so I'm going to use some pale blue just to lift that up a bit. That's the highlight on the jacket. The darker tone that I used for the skin at the side of the head, which is in shadow, this sort of red earth colour, I'm going to come back in with that now and just build that up. Again, I'm working on the side of the stick just to block in the colour more. And that leads me back to the back of the head, which I was readjusting just before I started the features. So I do like to work in a circle. Each thing relates to the next part so that you can check the proportions. Having a colour of pastel that's very close to the paper colour is useful because I can use that to cut in and cut away. And that gives me quite a different shape altogether, but a bit more convincing. Now at this stage it's just final touches. Again, half closed eyes, looking for any highlights that I might have missed, such as the highlight on the back of the neck there, and even using the same sort of colour in the hair. It's nice to tie up the colours at different parts so that the whole picture works as a unit. The nose is a little bit short, so again you can pull that down by just blending. See, even that little touch makes a difference. That's better. And carry on checking round to make sure there's nothing drastically out of proportion. If you can talk your friends and family into sitting for you for short poses like this, you'll get lots of practice and your confidence will be built up.
Artists have always been inspired by snow. Snow imposes a completely new order onto the landscape. It can soften hills, it can flatten foregrounds, But do you know one of the strangest things about a snow painting like this is there's not really a great deal of white in it. There's a slightly creamy yellowish tint to the middle ground here. There are some blues in the shadows. There are even some violets in the shadows. And there's an awful lot of reflected light, yellows, ochres, umbers and siennas that are picked up in the trees. So, when you come to do your own snow painting, do observe carefully. Look for the tones and the colours that you can see. We're now going to be working on a snow painting in the studio.
I have some photographs that I took earlier because it's too cold to work outside now, and I've been doing some tonal sketches of each of them, and this is the one that I think will work the best for our painting. Here's the tonal sketch that I've done, and you'll see that I've changed the composition quite a bit because I want to simplify it. I've used the idea of the bridge, and that's a good lead-in to the composition, and retained this lovely big tree at the side and some of the stones with snow covered. But I've opened up the back of the composition so that we've got a bit more distance, middle distance and further trees, so that we've got wider space, and retained the water. And I've also prepared the paper and just finish off masking the area that I'm going to paint on. And the reason for doing this is to give it a nice white edge once the painting's finished. Rough to give me a guideline as to where things will go, and before I start putting in some broad washes of colour, because the snow will mostly be in colour, some warm and some cool shadows, and before that I want to retain some pure white with some masking fluid. So what I do is I'm using an old brush, but I also dip it in water and soap and just take a little bit of fluid. I'm going to retain some white, and it's rather nice it doesn't go on too evenly because we don't want it too neat and tidy looking. And we'll have some on the tops of the stones. And maybe just take off the excess and roll it about a bit on this tree so that we might have some snow on here later. Masking fluid takes a few minutes to dry. But since we're not working on this area, I'm going to start with the sky first. I'm going to turn this upside down so that I can allow the water on the wet into wet sky to run down the way as it will be darker at the top. I'm going to start with some pale raw sienna, just as a very pale wash, and take it through here. And just miss out, I'm going to negative paint a couple of these trees. Negative painting, of course, means that you paint everything else except the tree, and eventually the tree itself will stand out. And I'm going to take some ultramarine, just with a slight touch of light red in it to make it a little bit more mauve, and take that right across and just let it run towards the top. It can mix slightly with the wet raw sienna. While that's still wet, I'm going to mix the colour for the distant trees, which again will be ultramarine and a little bit of burnt umber to make quite a neutral colour. And then while this is wet, I'll just drop it in and let it sort of fan out. It looks a little bit dark at the moment, but it will dry paler because it's going onto a wet area, and on top of that it's going to dry, watercolour does dry lighter anyway. So it's all the same colours mixing together, each getting a little bit warmer, and I'll leave the odd little bit of white spacing for tree trunks. I'm cleaning this up so that I keep my colours fresh, and that gives me a good clean reservoir area for the next area of trees. And I'm going to start off with the same types of colour, light red and raw sienna, and put into that, that's not quite dark enough, but if I add some burnt umber and a bit of blue, there we are, and that's it, let it run and go around this tree, so again negatively painting the shape. And as I go along, I just want to change the colour, drop some new colour in, and let's have a little bit of green made up with the same. Let's drop some dark green into that. That was with Windsor blue and raw sienna. Using my fingernail to flick in a few negative tree trunks while that paint is still damp. If it's too wet, it will just run in and create a reservoir, but if it's just at the right thickness, it will scratch out and leave me just light impressions of tree trunks. Now you'll have noticed that we've been mixing some fairly warm colours, because just because it's a snow scene, it doesn't mean to say it's to be cold. I'm going to take the same sort of golden wash, which I've just mixed up with raw sienna and light red, and a little touch of rose madder, which gives it a lovely sort of peachy warmth. And I'm going to take it through the snow area, and of course I can go right through the bridge because I've got the masking where I want it to be brilliant white. That fairly dry brush doesn't create a problem because we want it to be little patches of white here and there. Watch that doesn't bleed. And again, I'll miss out the tree, and I'll have some shadow, some cool colour, and I'll just put that in while that's still quite wet. This is called wet into wet, when you run one wet colour into another and just let it run and do its own thing. Just dab it out wherever you want to retrieve any white, and we'll have some more shadow down here. Bearing in mind where the light's coming from, which helps me with direction of shadow, I've put this arrow here just to remind me which side I want it to be lit from. Now on some of the winter trees, I'm going to mix some dark colour, and I'm mixing ultramarine with burnt umber to make a good dark neutral colour. And then, and I have to be quick here, I'm going to come down one side, the dark side of the tree, and then go straight into the water, just take the excess off and run back down with that, and that just loosens the paint and lets it run round the tree and soften it. Right, now for the foreground tree, and this will give you an opportunity to see that last technique close up. I'm going to make the dark brown and ultramarine mixture. I'll make it slightly warmer this time. Let's have a little bit of light red in it too, since this tree is much closer to the front. And then I'm going to start at the side, which is in shadow, and come down. It's not quite dark enough, but I'll come back on that. Wash the brush and go back straight in and just let it, see, watch it move. Remember, I've got some masking fluid on this too. Come down, let it run. If it doesn't run enough, just give it a little scrub, helping hand on its way. And into there. And picking up on that colour, we can take a few smaller branches. In fact, this is probably a good point to change brushes and go for the rigger brush, which is ideal for this because it's a long, fine brush which gives you a lot more random movement like this. Bringing it in and getting these sort of more natural shapes. They're also good for fairly thick colour, which if it's dragged across on the side, you'll get a lovely sort of random dry brush technique. And just a touch of the trunk. Switch back to the other brush and pop in a little bit of a darker shadow. This is quite a chunky tree, so it will have quite a strong shadow there. Coming over at the back. Right, I'm going to paint the water now, and I'm going to treat that area as one wet into wet area again, and just wet the whole area with the blue that I used in the sky. And then I'll start dropping in some of the colours that I used earlier. For the tree, for example, we'll have a bit of reflection down here and some down here. Again, don't panic when it runs, just let it do its own thing. In fact, along the bank will be quite dark as it just touches the dry. I'll let it run a little bit. I'm going to put in a little bit more blue. You'll probably have a little bit of reflection here from the bridge, not too much, don't want to get it too bitty, but while this bit in particular is still wet, I'm going to take out the paint again with a dry, clean brush, just by going across like that. And that gives you the effect of a ripple on the water. Now, before I forget, we've got some stones, remember, which were over here, little dark shapes, which will be here and here. And in fact, originally, I planned that we would have a bit of water leading you in at the back, which I've completely forgotten about. So bring that up, make that slightly darker here. There's a area where the water will come under and show up the other side of the bridge. Sort of uneven, there we are. Right, back to the stones, and we'll pop in some shadow just behind them so that they're seated on the ground. That helps to anchor. The shadow always helps to anchor the stones to the ground or anything else like the trees, etc. Now I'm going to work on the bridge, and I'm just going to pick up on some of the previous colour. It doesn't have to be too neat and tidy because it's a natural structure, and I'll just put in the posts first of all with the light red mixture that I had earlier. And then I'm going to make the darker colour again with ultramarine and burnt umber. Make sure the painting is completely dry before you remove the masking fluid. Right, now we're going to just add a figure to give it a little sense of proportion, and I'm going to just lightly place with pale raw sienna a stick to give me the basic size, the total height of the figure. If that was wrong, I could wipe it out quite easily, but let's just assume that our figure is going to be about that size. Now the stick represents the total height of the figure, so from that I'll go roughly halfway up, half again, which makes it an eighth. So the overall size, proportion of the head to body is 1/8. And I'm just putting this figure in dark. It's a cold day and he's going to be fairly huddled up against the cold. So I'm putting a bit of blue in here just to take the bulk of the clothing, and I'll take that down to just about halfway, and in fact there's a little interruption here because he's actually off the bridge. I'll put in his elbow and arm, and then I'll incorporate the leg into the stick. Keep it fairly bulky because he'll be fully clothed and probably great big boots on. Let's just anchor him to the ground with a bit of shadow while we're at it, because that's a fairly dark shadow. And then the other leg will be slightly shorter as he walks through the snow. He's out walking the dog on a cold winter's day. And just basically a blob of shadow and a highlight really, but at that standard you hardly see. There we are, that's enough just to give us a hint. No details. And now that he's in, I could lighten it a little, or I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll just darken it on this side with a bit of the very dark colour that I used on this tree. And he'd probably have his woolly hat on.
As always, the key to painting a good snow scene is observation. However, snowy days are often cold days, so use a camera, take some photos, and do some observation indoors as well, and look at how other artists have approached the theme. Goodbye until next time.